Have you ever walked into your garden after a long dry spell, looked down at your beds, and felt that quiet, heavy disappointment settle in your chest? You push your shovel into the ground, expecting the soft, dark, crumbly black gold you see in gardening magazines. But instead, you hit a wall. You put your weight on the spade, and it practically bounces back. Eventually, you pry loose a chunk of gray, yellow, or deep red earth, and it looks more like a rough, sun-baked brick than garden soil. You squeeze it in your hand, and it feels almost like concrete. I know that feeling because I lived through it myself. Years ago, when I first stood in my new yard, struggling to scrape up a single shovelful of what felt like pure gumbo mud, I cursed the ground beneath my feet. I wanted to run a mile. I wondered why nature had handed me such terrible soil. Then I would look at gardening magazines filled with perfect beds of loose, sandy loam, and before I had even planted my first seed, I already felt like I had failed. But what if the soil you have been fighting all this time, the clay you may have been cursing, is actually a forgotten masterpiece? What if clay itself was never the real problem? What if the problem is the way we have been taught to treat it? And what if, without realizing it, we have been starving, compacting, and tearing apart the very engine room that makes our gardens work? Welcome back to Earthly Delights. Today, we are stepping away from the machinery, turning our backs on corporate fertilizers, and traveling deep into the atomic layers of clay itself. We are going to explore the science-backed truths that can completely change the way you see this sticky, heavy ground. We will also look at some of the most destructive, highly upvoted pieces of expert advice still circulating on popular gardening websites today, and explain exactly why those practices can ruin your soil. By the end of this video, I don't want you to simply stop worrying about your clay soil. I want you to start loving it, because clay holds a remarkable hidden power, a biological blueprint capable of turning your garden or farm into a self-feeding, drought-resistant, highly fertile paradise. So, are you ready to stop fighting the ground beneath your feet and finally start understanding it? Let's get dirty. Part 1. The Invisible Giant, Under the Microscope. Let's begin with one simple question. What exactly is clay? When you look closely at sandy soil, you can actually see the individual grains. They are relatively large, jagged, electrically neutral particles of silicon dioxide, essentially tiny pieces of rock. But try looking at a single clay particle through an ordinary school microscope, and you will see little more than a blurry mass. According to the USDA definition, clay particles are smaller than 0.002 millimeters in diameter. That is almost unimaginably small. If we enlarged one grain of sand until it was the size of a basketball, then a clay particle would be roughly comparable to one tiny, flat grain of rice. Think about that image for a moment. Imagine one bucket filled with basketballs and another packed tightly with flat grains of rice. Which bucket allows water to rush through more easily? Obviously, the basketballs, the sand. And which one holds onto that water more tightly, layer after layer? The rice, the clay. Because clay particles are incredibly tiny and flat, they possess one extraordinary physical characteristic: surface area. Take a gram of sand, and its total surface area is relatively insignificant. But take a single gram of clay, just a tiny pinch, and imagine somehow unfolding every microscopic plate-like surface within it. That tiny amount of material can contain hundreds of square meters of surface area. A single teaspoon of clay-rich soil can contain more mineral surface area than the entire floor of a small suburban home. And now we arrive at the real secret. Every square millimeter of that enormous mineral surface is electrically charged. Clay carries a permanent negative charge. Why should that matter to you when you're standing in your backyard holding a muddy trowel? Because in soil chemistry, opposites attract. Many of the essential nutrients plants need to survive and thrive, including calcium, magnesium, potassium, and iron, exist in the soil as positively charged ions called cations. Sandy soil is electrically neutral. It has very little ability to grab and hold those nutrients. So when fertilizer is applied to sand, the next heavy rainfall can carry those valuable nutrients downward into the groundwater, leaving your plants hungry and your wallet lighter. Clay behaves completely differently. Clay is a giant mineral magnet. Its negatively charged surfaces attract those positively charged nutrients, grab onto them, and hold them securely until plant roots come searching for them. So the red, yellow, or gray mud sticking stubbornly to your boots is not merely dirt. It is a highly charged structural masterpiece created by nature to function as a permanent, high-capacity nutrient bank. Part 2. The nutrient bank that never runs dry. If clay is a nutrient bank, the next question is obvious. How do we measure how much wealth that bank can hold? Soil scientists use a measurement called cation exchange capacity, or CEC. You can think of CEC as the credit limit of your soil. It describes how much capacity that soil has to hold and exchange the essential positively charged ions we just discussed. And when you compare the numbers, the difference is staggering. A typical sandy soil may have a CEC below 2, sometimes climbing to around 5 milliequivalents per 100 grams. In other words, it has almost no credit available. A rich loam soil might reach somewhere around 15 to 20, but clay is a completely different story. Even a heavily weathered clay such as kaolinite, which is common in many older soils, may begin around 10 to 15. And if you happen to have a 2-1 structured clay such as smectite or montmorillonite, the type found in dark, expansive soils across parts of the American Great Plains, the Pacific Coast, and many fertile river valleys, CEC can rise beyond 80 and reach as high as 150. The reason is the unique crystalline structure of smectite clay. These clay minerals contain one aluminium octahedral sheet positioned between two silica tetrahedral sheets. The chemical relationship between these two 2s1 layers is remarkably flexible, allowing both water and dissolved nutrients to move deep inside the internal spaces of the clay crystals themselves. When wet, these clays can swell by as much as 25%, revealing an enormous amount of internal surface area that sandy soils simply cannot provide. So what does all of this mean when you're actually working in your garden? It means clay acts as a slow-release reservoir for life-giving nutrients. Clay particles hold tightly onto ammonium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, helping prevent those nutrients from simply washing away. As your plant roots grow, they release positively charged hydrogen ions. The roots effectively exchange those hydrogen ions for calcium, magnesium, or potassium being held on the surfaces of the clay particles. It is an elegant microscopic barter system taking place beneath your feet 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When you grow plants in clay, you are working with a level of natural soil fertility that gardeners on sandy ground can only dream about. You don't need to fertilize nearly as often. In fact, many gardens growing in clay can thrive without chemical fertilizers at all, relying on this highly active exchange system. That sticky yellow or red soil is not simply a curse. It is an asset quietly doing a tremendous amount of work for you, helping save money while also keeping excess fertilizer from washing into our waterways. Part 3. The Drought Advantage. Picture this. It is the middle of July. The summer heat is brutal, the wind is dry, and more than 2 weeks have passed without rain. Across the street, your neighbor is outside every evening dragging a heavy garden hose behind them. They have invested in beautiful, expensive raised beds filled with loose, sandy loam. They water those beds for an hour, but by the following afternoon, the soil already feels dry and crumbly, and their tomato plants are beginning to wilt. Meanwhile, you have watered your in-ground clay beds only once that week. You look at your plants, and the leaves are still firm, green, and thriving. How can that happen? Magic? No. It is the thermodynamics of clay. Those incredibly small, flat, overlapping clay particles create millions of microscopic pore spaces. These tiny pores attract polar water molecules and hold onto them against the constant pull of gravity and evaporation. Deep in the root zone, clay can remain moist and cool long after sandy or loamy soils have already dried. For perennial plants, ornamental shrubs, and fruit trees, that ability can literally become a lifesaver. Clay also holds soil and water together with tremendous physical strength, which gives plant roots a powerful anchor. In sandy ground, violent winds and storms can loosen perennial plants or even uproot mature trees, leaving their roots exposed. Clay holds fast, and even during the dead of winter, that dense structure offers another hidden advantage. In northern climates, soils repeatedly freeze and thaw throughout the season. In loose sandy or loamy ground, those cycles can produce something called plant heaving. Plants are gradually pushed upward out of the soil, exposing their delicate root crowns to freezing air and sometimes killing them. But the plate-like particles in clay align into stable sheets, creating a thermal buffer that can reduce winter heaving and help protect valuable plantings through severe freezing conditions. But I can almost hear the question you're asking. If clay holds water so well, why does my soil look like cracked desert ground in August? And why do my plants seem to drown in puddles every time it rains? That is exactly the question we need to ask. And the answer is not necessarily a flaw in the clay itself. The answer lies in how we manage it. So let's look at the first major mistake millions of gardeners make. A mistake that is still being presented as a solution on popular gardening websites today. Part 4. The Sand Trap, the Concrete Myth. Open any search engine right now and type in "how to improve clay soil drainage." I can almost guarantee that somewhere on that first page, someone will tell you to add sand. At first, the logic sounds perfectly reasonable. Clay contains the smallest soil particles and drains slowly. Sand contains the largest particles and drains quickly. Mix the two together, and surely you end up with perfect, free-draining loam, right? Stop. Do not do this. Under any circumstances, do not add sand to your clay soil. Remember the basketball and rice comparison from earlier? When coarse grains of sand are mixed into heavy clay soil, the microscopic plate-like clay particles do not simply sit neatly beside the sand. They move. Those tiny particles slide into the empty spaces and pores between the larger sand grains. They fill the gaps. Then, under pressure from water and foot traffic, the clay begins acting like a binding material, effectively gluing those sand particles together. You haven't created loam. You have created a dense, heavily compacted, low-grade matrix that behaves much more like concrete. It becomes difficult to work, resistant to water movement, and capable of permanently damaging the structure of your soil. Soil scientists at the University of California, the USDA, and Illinois Extension have studied this problem for decades. Their conclusion is clear. The only sand-to-clay ratio that genuinely improves drainage is approximately a true 1.1 blend by volume. Now think about what that actually means. Suppose you want to improve the top 6 inches of your garden bed, the critical root zone for most vegetables, flowers, and shrubs. You would have to spread approximately 6 inches of sand over the entire surface of that bed and then thoroughly blend it to depth. For just one small 100-square-foot garden bed, you would be dealing with nearly 2 tons of sand. On any realistic gardening scale, that becomes a financial, physical, and ecological nightmare. If you have already made this mistake, don't despair. But if you're creating a new bed or trying to repair an old one, put the sand down. The real path toward loosening clay does not come from adding more geology. It comes from biology. Part 5. The Tilling Illusion. Why the fix makes it worse. Every spring, one familiar sound begins echoing through farms and neighborhoods again. The roar of the rototiller. There is something deeply satisfying about the ritual. You roll the machine onto a hard, cracked clay bed, pull the cord, and let those spinning blades tear through the earth. Within an hour, everything looks transformed. The bed appears loose, dark, fluffy, and smells like fresh living soil. You plant your seedlings, admire the results of your hard work, and walk away feeling proud. Then, about 6 weeks later, something strange happens. A heavy rain arrives. Then you get a week of sunshine. When you return to the bed, the soil has set almost like a plaster mold. The surface is covered with a hard, nearly impermeable crust, and your seedlings are suddenly struggling. So what happened? The rototiller lied to you. When those steel blades spin rapidly through clay soil, they do more than break apart visible clods. They pulverize and shatter the delicate microscopic infrastructure that gives the soil stability. They tear through mycorrhizal fungal networks, the invisible living threads weaving through undisturbed soil and helping connect individual particles into stable, sponge-like structures called aggregates. Without those biological anchors, the clay loses its structural integrity. Then rain arrives. The newly pulverized particles begin flowing together, almost like flour mixed into water, eventually settling into a dense, airless slab. And the problem goes even deeper. As the heavy metal tiller blades repeatedly strike downward, they tend to reach approximately the same depth every time. Below those blades, the clay becomes compressed into a dense layer known as a hardpan or tillage pan. For plant roots, that hardpan can become a death sentence. It acts like a solid physical barrier. As the roots of your vegetables or fruit trees grow downward and reach that compacted layer, they can no longer penetrate it. Instead, they turn sideways, producing a shallow, weaker root system. Then rain arrives again. Water cannot easily move through the packed clay beneath the loosened surface. Your garden bed becomes a literal bathtub. Water collects in the cultivated upper layer and fills the pore spaces. Because air cannot diffuse efficiently through standing water, the roots lose access to oxygen. They literally begin to drown. As those roots start rotting in an anaerobic, airless environment, the biology of the soil also changes. Beneficial oxygen-loving microbes die away, while anaerobic organisms begin replacing them and producing toxic alcohols and hydrogen sulfide as organic matter ferments. That alcohol damages the delicate microscopic root hairs plants depend on for nutrient absorption. And that sour, fermented smell? It becomes like a beacon, drawing destructive slugs directly toward already weakened plants. Subsoil compaction created by rototilling can reduce crop yields by anywhere from 5 to 50%, even while the surface appears beautifully loose. You can be standing there admiring fluffy soil while a serious barrier is forming only 6 inches below your feet. So how do we escape this cycle? How do we create soil that stays loose, breathes properly, and drains well without depending on heavy machinery? Part 6. Glomalin, the biological glue. The secret to transforming clay soil involves a substance most gardeners have probably never heard of. In fact, science itself did not know it existed until 1996. It was discovered by USDA soil scientist Dr. Sarah Wright. She called it glomalin. Glomalin is a glycoprotein, a sticky sugar protein compound produced by mycorrhizal fungi as they grow throughout the soil. Imagine these fungi as an enormous living web made from microscopic threads. As those threads push between the flat sheets of clay, they coat mineral particles with this sticky biological glue. Under the influence of glomalin, those tiny, flat, rice-like particles of clay begin sticking together. They form larger, stable structures known as aggregates. Think about what happens to the soil when this transformation occurs. Instead of flat clay sheets stacking tightly together like a compressed deck of playing cards, you begin getting rounded, stable crumbs of soil that resemble pieces of a chocolate cookie. And between those crumbs, large, permanent pore spaces begin forming. Those spaces become the lungs and blood vessels of your soil. They allow oxygen to move downward toward plant roots and soil organisms. They allow excess rainwater to drain away within hours while still holding the right amount of capillary moisture inside the soil crumbs themselves. And here is the truly remarkable part. Research has shown that glomalin can account for roughly 27% of all carbon stored in soils where mycorrhizal plants are growing. It is also incredibly stable, remaining in the soil for somewhere between 7 and 42 years, depending on conditions, and outlasting humic acid by orders of magnitude. This is how nature builds soil. Nature does not depend on steel blades. It uses biological glue. But there is one catch. You cannot buy glomalin in a bottle. There is no container sitting on a garden center shelf that you can pour into your yard. The only way to bring glomalin into your clay soil is to cultivate the fungi responsible for producing it. And that means we have to stop doing the things that destroy those fungi, especially tilling and leaving soil bare, and begin feeding the system from the surface downward. Part 7. The Art of Doing Nothing. The No-Dig Approach. And this brings us to one of the most revolutionary, yet beautifully simple gardening methods of our time, the no-dig approach, pioneered and popularized by British grower Charles Dowding. When you adopt no-dig gardening, you make one fundamental promise to your soil. You will disturb it as little as practically possible. Instead of digging compost into heavy clay, you simply place that compost on top. Then you allow nature to do the work. If you're creating a new growing bed over weed-filled lawn or heavy clay, here is the exact process. First, prepare the surface. Cut tall grass and woody weeds all the way down to ground level. For persistent, deep-rooted weeds such as dock, use a sharp spade to cut through the roots, approximately 15 centimeters below the surface, leaving the remainder underground to decay. Second, create a cardboard barrier. Cover the entire area with thick, unprinted cardboard, overlapping every edge by at least 6 inches so that no light can pass through the gaps. Third, thoroughly wet the cardboard. This is an important step that people often overlook. Many shipping boxes contain water-resistant coatings that can initially repel moisture and create a barrier beneath your new bed. Drenching the cardboard softens it, encourages decomposition, and helps attract earthworms upward from the clay underneath. Fourth, add the compost. Spread approximately 10 to 15 centimeters of well-decomposed compost directly over the cardboard. You can use aged manure, leaf mold, municipal compost, or mushroom compost. Fifth, plant immediately. Yes, you really can sow seeds or place plants directly into that compost layer from the very first day. Over the next 2 or 3 months, the cardboard completely smothers the weeds underneath. Meanwhile, your plants begin growing comfortably in the compost. Eventually, their roots move straight through the softened, decomposing cardboard and enter the nutrient-rich clay below. But does this actually work? At Homeacres, Charles Dowding has conducted famous side-by-side comparisons between dug and undug beds for more than a decade. Year after year, the no-dig beds consistently match or outperform the dug beds, sometimes producing up to 5% more crop by weight while requiring only a fraction of the labor. There is, however, one golden rule when practicing no-dig gardening on clay. Never step on your growing beds, especially when they are wet. Remember that clay consists of microscopic, flat plates. When the soil becomes saturated, those plates are suspended on thin films of water. Step onto wet clay, and the pressure pushes those plates tightly against one another, squeezing out microscopic pockets of air and locking the soil into a dense, impenetrable mass. Create permanent paths between your growing beds. If you absolutely have to step onto a bed, stand on a wooden board to spread your weight over a wider area. And after heavy rain, give clay at least 24 to 48 hours to drain before you begin working it again. Part 8. The Tools of Transformation. Biology in Action. But what if your clay is severely compacted deeper underground and you want to accelerate the transformation? This is where we can combine no-dig gardening with several powerful biological tools that work from the inside out. First, bio-drilling with cover crops. Instead of attacking hardpan with iron, allow plants to do the drilling for you. One of the absolute champions of breaking through clay is the daikon radish, particularly varieties such as daikon driller. These regeneratively grown radishes send down thick, aggressive taproots capable of cutting through compacted clay like living drills, reaching depths greater than 1.8 meters. Those roots physically fracture the clay and open new pathways for both air and water. Then winter arrives. When a hard frost kills the plant, that enormous root begins decomposing exactly where it grew. What remains is a deep biological tunnel known as a biopore, filled with rich organic material. Earthworms move into those tunnels, and when the next growing season arrives, crop roots can follow those same channels straight downward, beyond the old compacted layer. Pair daikon radish with winter rye, which produces a dense network of fibrous roots, capable of weaving through the upper layers of clay and binding fine particles into beautiful aggregates, and the soil begins assembling its own structure. Second, charged biochar. Biochar is a highly porous, almost pure form of carbon produced by heating organic material under low oxygen conditions. In sandy soil, fine biochar may be preferred, but when working with clay, we want coarse pieces of biochar, roughly the size of a pea. Those coarse, rigid carbon particles act like small physical wedges, keeping the flat clay sheets from stacking tightly together and sealing the soil. But there is one thing to remember. Never apply raw biochar directly to your soil. Raw biochar is inert and behaves like a dry sponge, absorbing moisture and nutrients away from your plants. Before using it, you need to charge it. You can do that by mixing it into an active compost pile or soaking it in a nutrient-rich liquid, such as fish emulsion, for at least 2 weeks before applying it to the soil. Third, the sandwich bed, or low hugelkultur. If your garden sits in a low-lying area that frequently floods, you can build what permaculturalists often call a woody bed. Begin with a base layer of heavy tree branches and woody debris. Cover that with a layer of your native clay. Then finish the bed with compost on top. The buried wood acts like a giant underground sponge. During flooding, it absorbs excess water and helps reduce root rot. Then, as conditions become dry again, it slowly releases that stored moisture back into the surrounding clay. And finally, gypsum. Use with care. You've probably seen products claiming that gypsum is a miracle clay breaker. But soil science shows that gypsum, or calcium sulfate, is effective specifically in sodic soils. Soils containing high concentrations of sodium, which are common in parts of the arid western United States and some coastal regions. Sodium ions force clay particles apart, causing them to disperse and seal the soil. The calcium supplied by gypsum replaces that sodium, allowing clay particles to flocculate and improving drainage. But if your clay soil is not sodic, applying gypsum is simply a waste of money and may actually cause important magnesium and potassium to leach from the soil. So get a soil test first. Conclusion: embracing the earth. At the end of the day, gardening is about much more than simply growing plants. It is a relationship. It is an ongoing conversation between us, the ground beneath our feet, and the living world surrounding us. When we walk into the garden carrying a rototiller or a bag of chemicals, trying to force the earth into some artificial, pre-packaged idea of perfect soil, we are playing a game we cannot win. We are fighting against millions of years of evolutionary design. Clay soil is not a mistake. It is a powerful, nutrient-dense foundation that fed ancient civilizations along the Nile, helped build the fertile soils of the American plains, and supported forests that clean our atmosphere. Yes, getting started can require some elbow grease. And yes, clay asks something from us that modern life does not always encourage: patience. It asks us to slow down. It asks us to wait while biology quietly performs its invisible work beneath the surface. But isn't that one of the reasons we garden in the first place? To slow down? To reconnect with something larger than ourselves? When you finally embrace your clay, when you feed it with organic compost, protect it beneath mulch, and allow living fungi to build their beautiful glomalin-rich networks, you are doing more than building a garden. You are healing a piece of the earth. And in return, that clay will reward you. It will hold precious water through the driest summers. It will provide your crops with a steady, natural supply of nutrients. And it will remain as a living, permanent reminder of what becomes possible when we stop trying to rule nature and begin learning how to walk beside her. Thank you so much for watching Earthly Delights. If this video changed the way you see the soil beneath your feet, hit that subscribe button, share it with a fellow gardener struggling with difficult ground, and tell me in the comments below, what color is the clay in your yard, and how are you going to celebrate it this season? Until next time, keep your boots dirty, keep your mind open, and happy growing.